Before I start the meeting, it is with sadness that I announce the passing of Councillor Mick Pendergast, who died on Sunday. Mick had represented the people of the Peninsula Board since 2015. Our sincerest condolences and deepest thoughts go out to Mick's family and friends. Before I ask us to stand for a minute's silence in respect, does anyone have anything they wish to say? Councillor Golding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to say, whilst I didn't agree with a lot of Mick's politics, he was a thoroughly nice guy, and he was a hard-working member, a strong advocate for his ward and the residents in his area, and hard-working. So I think he's a sad loss to the authority overall, and it's a rather sobering thought that Mick is the fourth colleague that we've lost in this council. So in public health terms, I think being a local authority member is not a particularly healthy occupation, but that aside, I think, you know, it is a loss to the council, it's a loss to Medway, and it'll be sadly missed.
Thank you, Councillor Golding. As a mark of respect, I will ask that we all stand for a minute's silence. Right, we'll take item 1 on the agenda. That's apologies for absence.
None, Chair. None received.
Sorry. Thank you. Take item 2 on the agenda. That's a record of the meeting from the 23rd of June. Can I sign the record of the meeting held on the 23rd of June 2022 as correct? Agreed? Yep. Thank you. We'll take item 3 on the agenda, which is urgent matters. I understand there are no urgent matters this evening. Item 4 on the agenda is declarations of disclosable pecuniary interests and other significant interests. Are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Golding.
Thank you, Chairman. In item 7, which is the interim auditor's annual report, I've got a number of OSIs. I point out they're OSIs, not pecuniary. I'm a director of the Medway Development Company, and I'm chair of the subsidiary company, Medway Development Company, Land and Projects. Under working with partners, there's mention of the Medway and Swale Integrated Care Partnership. I'm a member of the Medway and Swale Integrated Care Partnerships Property Forum. There's also mention of the Transformation Board and the Procurement Board, both of which I chair. And there's mention of the council plan and also the council's IT. Both of those parts of the council are in my portfolio.
Thank you very much. Councillor TJ.
Thank you, Chair. Similar to Councillor Golding, have an OSR with Kindy, recently been appointed as director.
Anyone else? We'll take item 5 on the agenda, which is the annual governance statement 21-22, pages 15 to 30. I'll ask Bhupinder Gill to introduce this report. Bhupinder.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll introduce this very briefly. Members who have served on the Audit Committee for more than one term will know that this is a report that comes to this committee annually, setting out officers' perspectives in terms of the governance arrangements for the authority. It follows a standard national framework that's produced by SITFA and SOLIS, and that framework has been in place for a number of years without any significant amendment. There was a revision a couple of years ago as a result of the pandemic to pick up on changes that would result as a result of responding to the pandemic. The publication of the report follows a standardised format, and those of you who were on the committee last year will note that the report is substantially similar to the report that you considered last year, in that the governance framework adopted by the council hasn't really changed over that period of time. The key thing I'd like to point you to is the head, the opinion, which is stated on page 28 of the agenda, which is the opinion of our head of internal audit and counter fraud. And James is here as well at the committee, and he stated in there that we have an effective framework to summarise what he said effectively there, that we do have an effective framework for governance within the authority. I don't propose to go through it in any more detail than that. And if there are any questions, I will gladly try to answer those, but maybe seek support from my colleagues around the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhupinder. I'll open the floor up. Any questions? Members? Tristan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions, if I may. So my first one, just on relation to the report on 28, it does indicate there that the internal audit opinion was that there are enhanced or strengthened or where additional controls to reduce the council's exposure to risk, where findings have been identified, actions have been agreed by management. It'd just be quite helpful to see, maybe in an appendix in future, where what substantive elements there have been, where we have perhaps had to review in light of maybe some governance failures on non-specific issues, what those were. Because when we're going over these documents as a revision, and clearly we are doing that, in some ways that's an element of success, that this is working, these documents, if indeed we see where things have changed in future. And I'm just wondering whether that's something we could add to this in future, where if we are redoing on an annual basis, we could just see some of those elements highlighted where things have been improved upon. And just lastly, I have looked at some of the other, you're right, there is a standard way of presenting these documents, and this one is very similar to other local authorities. I note in other local authorities, the core principles are aligned to sort of national positions, and I'm just wondering if, in terms of the next year's iteration, given the sort of situation we're in at the moment, is there anything we should be learning from this document that potentially has significant issues for us going forward, given our current financial position? And I specifically reference to that other items on this in the agenda, so particularly financial probity and issues around membership of third-party organisations. Okay, just those 2 points. Thank you.
So I'll deal with those in reverse order, if I may. Looking at the document, what I am proposing to do is to undertake a thorough review of the contents of the document and the presentation of the document in time for next year. And that may result in some changes, and I can't categorically state that they will, but it is a piece of work that I'm proposing to do and be well ahead of the curve for next year. So that may result in some changes. In terms of those areas where there have been some changes in terms of governance arrangements following audit reviews, and James is in the room and he can probably add to this. But my understanding is, firstly, where those changes are agreed by management, they are monitored through our processes within the Office of Court to make sure that they are delivered, and they're delivered within a certain time frame. And within that, there are separate reports, I think, that come to Audit Committee, and certainly in relation to those that are deemed of a high priority, which remain outstanding, and advise you as to when those are completed. But perhaps I could throw this over to James, who probably knows more of the detail on this than I do.
The opinion in the document is essentially what's included in the annual internal audit report that you will have seen in June. Usually these documents would be side by side, or at least they have been in previous years. So all of the information about the action taken by management is actually in all of our update reports. Appreciate it's not within this document. As I say, usually our annual report would usually be side by side with this. So all the information referred
Through you, Chair, I think what we'll try and do is coordinate as officers to make sure that actually, again, for next year, you have both documents on the same agenda so that you can see the detail of both at the same time.
If I could just come back, I would fully agree with that. And in fact, they are heavily linked, maybe even referencing them in the appendices. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing the version. But as I say, this is a high-level sort of document, which, and as I say, I've looked at authority documents, is very similar across other local authorities, but it's not particularly detailed. And so, as you say, if it was linked to that in a way, that would see we would be able to probe some of the aspects to it. Okay, I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chairman, because there are other things that come up later.
Thanks, Chair. Can you? Yeah, sorry. No, Councillor Osborne, I already asked the question. I was. I'm just interested in some of the actions, that's being agreed, actually. I know you probably say is in another report, but I just wonder if you could give us just a brief overview of some of the things.
It's very difficult off the top of my head, because we conduct a number of reviews across the...
I think if I can just help James out on that, Councillor Teach, and it may be an idea, as James has said, there was a report that came back to the Audit Committee at the last meeting of the committee, and it may be an easier way to actually reference that document and have a look at that rather than trying to rely on James's memory. I'm sure it's a very good memory, but it's always dangerous to rely on memory rather than reverting back to fact.
It's very dangerous, especially when I'm trying to I'm reviewing reports across two authorities, so there is a danger of mix-up. So, yeah, I think it would be best to refer you back to the annual report that was presented in June.
I think if the two reports are put together, then I think they'll come up with a solution at the end of the day. So, with that in mind, the recommendation is 7.1. The committee is asked to comment on, which we have, and approve the annual governance statement. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Now take item 6 on the agenda, which is Speak Up, Anti-Bribery and Anti-Money Laundering Policies report on instances from September 2021 to August 2022. That's on pages 31 to 34 of the agenda. And I'll ask again Bhupinder Gill to introduce this report.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, I'll be very brief in outlining this report and presenting it. Covers 3 policies of the council: Speak Up, which colloquially used to be called whistleblowing, anti-bribery and anti-money laundering policies and reports to this committee are instances of where we've had complaints effectively in relation to each of those three policies, and those numbers and what, if anything, was done in relation to those. The detail in relation to the Speak Up policy is set out in paragraph 3 of the report, and during the course of the last year we received 2 complaints which are set out in the table there. In relation to the first one, as you can see, whilst we received some complaints and concerns regarding unethical behaviour in a team, that has been investigated and it was found to be unsubstantiated. The second matter in there was in relation to, again, unethical behaviour by an employee and some contractors, and their investigation was done and we found that the conduct of an employee and a contractor was found to be short of the standards that we would expect, and managerial action was taken in relation to those. In terms of a comparison, just to see what the trends are, you can see in paragraph 3.2 that last year there was 1 complaint and the year before that there was 2. So we're pretty much in line with the instances there. In relation to both anti-bribery and anti-money laundering, there were no complaints raised during the course of the year. Thank you, Chair.
Once again, I'll open it up to the floor. Councillor Golding.
Thank you, Chair. These are all very important policies. Certainly what we used to call the whistleblowing policy, I think is key to sort of the ethical and sort of feeling about the organisation. It's interesting, paragraph 3.2, where it says whistleblowing for the last 3 years, but we only get 2 years worth, or perhaps I've missed something. I think it would be useful to actually have more than 2 or 3 years, because I think the trend is very important, because there's a balance here, isn't it? Because if we have very low levels of people speaking up, are they afraid to speak up, or are we not promoting the policy through the organisation sufficiently? And obviously the other end of the scale, if we get loads of them, there's obviously something wrong culturally in the organisation, that we've got that. So there's, well, they're both cultural things. So I think it would be better if we had a longer period to look at, so we can get this. And to me, 1 or 2, I think it's tending on the scale of saying, well, are we promoting the policy for sufficiently enough, and are people actually happy to speak up? If there'd been maybe 3 or 4, that would probably be a better sort of, which I think we have had in previous years. It's bad, as James said, to rely on memory, but I'm sure we've had around about 3 or 4 years in the past. But apart from that, it's all very good. It's good to see that certainly as far as the anti-bribery and anti-money laundering, there's been no concerns, which I think speaks very well of the organisation. Thank you, Chair.
Anyone else? Justin?
Just a couple of things. So first of all, just on the council website at the moment, so if I Google whistleblowing, I will come up with a document that's from 2016, which I don't think is the current updated one. So can I just request that web page be taken down, because that might open us up to some concern. If people are finding or Googling whistleblowing and finding a 2016 web page that I think is still live, I think I was going to show you, but unfortunately the internet is not working. So that's my first point. You probably might come back up with me on that very quickly, because I suspect it's not live, and I found an old cached version or something along those lines. So the second element is just around, one of the things that was raised 2 years ago was the qualification of, if someone made an allegation, whether that could negatively impact them if that allegation was found to be not accurate because of counter allegations of malicious intent or false allegations being made. Can I just get some clarity that even within the current policy, the Speak Easy policy, there is no malice intent, or we wouldn't challenge on any issue of malice back onto that individual if they were to make a complaint? The reason I ask that is because if someone thinks, if I disclose something, well, that could mean that I get, the council might come back and say, well, actually, you're doing that because you hate X or Y, or there's a motive for that, and so therefore we're going to come after you. That might put people off complaining. Now, I've got no evidence for that. That's anecdotal comment that I'm making there. But certainly, I note there have been remarks made by senior solicitors that I think in 2019 that, and it might be that we've changed this, that some councils are still qualifying their complaint with, we might come after you if it's a false one, or if we deem it false, or indeed if anyone else could deem it as malicious that you're making this complaint. I just want some clarity around that, perhaps. I mean, obviously there's only 2 cases, but we haven't gone back to those people to challenge them on, in this case, around those sort of allegations. And then just thirdly, my point was following Councillor Goldvin's actually. I just wondered if there was it would be helpful to have some peer authority comparisons on this, because I don't quite know, is 2 I mean, it sounds like a very low number, but if other local authorities have 0, then it's obviously 2 more than them. And if Brighton is getting 35, then it might be the case that we're not doing something that they should be. Or is it accessible? Is it well known about? Is it being seen internally? Is it easily? Are people able to access the service? Is there a magic? In the old days, there used to be a magic phone which someone could call up and make the complaint. Does that phone still exist, like a red phone in your office or something? I don't know. But again, it'd be just helpful to see just some peer numbers. How does this compare with other areas? That's my third point.
Rupinder or Katie?
Thank you, Chair. So, for the avoidance of doubt, I don't have a bat phone in my office. It's just a standard issue. And the bat phone is currently manned by Sam, who all whistleblowing complaints actually end up being shared with in the first instance, and then she brings those through to a group of us who consider any concerns that are raised under the policy in order to determine what we should do about those. More than happy to look into getting details of concerns and allegations raised in comparative peer family for future years to see if we're on par with other organisations or not. In relation to the specific details of the whistleblowing policy, I haven't got the policy in front of me, but it is pretty standard in most policies to say that, you can rest assured that we will deal with any concerns raised, provided they are raised in good faith. There is a balancing act to be undertaken in encouraging complaints and complainants to come forward with concerns, but at the same time, we have to remember that there are occasionally those in society who wish to make complaints in bad faith, and sometimes they are malicious, and therefore, provided people make complaints and they genuinely believe the contents of their complaint, then they have nothing to fear. But we should be careful about encouraging malicious complaints.
Katie, do you want to talk about the webpage?
Just briefly, thank you, Chair, through you. So there's partly an issue with the way the committee minutes are actually referenced by Google. So one of the things you'll find is that every document that we've ever published via an audit committee, or any committee for that matter, is somewhere cached on our website, and we're not able to take that stuff down because it represents the democratic process that's happened up to that point. But we do also have some work to do, I think, in tidying up the referencing on our internal website, so where you might also be able to find access to those documents where we've got an archive. And so there's some work underway to make sure that the database is cleansed of some of that older stuff. But you will always be able to Google a 26 Medway whistleblowing policy because it exists and it got approved by this committee. So to some extent, that's always going to be there, but we'll do our best to make sure our website's tidier.
If I could just come back on that point, I think I Googled whistleblowing 2016 and it wasn't linked to a committee, it was just a standard web page, and I don't know if it's still live or not. I just thought I'd raise that because it could be that Speak Easy is something that we know because we're internal, but ordinarily people wouldn't call it that. It's not something which is a standard phrase. So someone might Google whistleblowing because that is what it's known first and find an old policy there. Yeah, and I just thought that would be raised. Just lastly, on a very separate point, just on third-party complaints. So clearly we have a number of third-party bodies, Kindy, MCG. If someone is whistleblowing on behalf of those organisations, because we are a primary funding source and from a governance perspective, we have elements of control there. Where do they have separate whistleblowing or speakeasy policies? Who is monitoring those? And because ultimately it's public money, and we ultimately are providing them with cash to provide their services. So are we responsible, given we're the funders of issues there, or do they have their own processes internally? And if they do, how do we see those reporting process? Do they report to us if there are any concerns internally within those private sector bodies or nominally private sector bodies?
Bhupinder.
So we deal with those in two ways. Firstly, if a complaint comes in to us and the concern is raised through the council in relation to one of our contractors or a body that we may fund using public monies, then again, that will come through the process and we will consider what action we can take. And as mentioned in the report there in paragraph 3.1, one of the complaints that we had was about a contractor, and we followed that through with the external company, seeking them or asking them to investigate that matter, and they reported back in terms of what action they had taken. So we certainly followed that through. In terms of any concerns or complaints that are raised directly with the company, there is no formal arrangement for them to report back into our cycle of whistleblowing. However, I suspect that may well be picked up as part of contract management with the individual service managers, who would have regular meetings in terms of the performance of that, in terms of the performance of the work under the contracts. So as far as I'm aware, that there is no direct link there. But again, they're a private company, and it's a matter for them to have their policies. Although I appreciate the point that you're making. So if we as an authority are alerted to it, then we do go away and look at it and see what we can do.
And we're fortunate they have a director for MDC. So I'm going to ask Adrian to...
Well, I can't speak for Kindy, but I can speak for MDC. I mean, MDC has only got 6 employees, so I don't think we're at the stage of our development where we need to have the systems and policies in place. Work alongside those half a dozen people, know them exceptionally well. If the organisation is bigger, yes, that will be the time, I think, to put those sorts of policies and things into place. But I don't think for an organisation with 6 employees, that would be a suitable thing to do, to be honest with you.
Lauren.
Thank you. I mean, just on that point, I mean, I would be interested, I guess, to know if there's any legal obligations on companies of any size if they had to have whistleblowing policies. I wasn't aware if it was, contingent on a certain number of employees. I wasn't aware of that. So if you have a different view, Bhupinder, I think I'd be grateful if you could let us know. My question was really not so much on the substance of this paper, but more about just a general query that I have with the risk ratings in the risk management opinions that are given for all papers. And I'll just bring it up here because it's the first paper that we've come across tonight. And it's the risk ratings of, C2, B3, that kind of thing. So I'm a relatively new counsellor. I don't actually know what that means. And there's nothing in these papers that directs me to another document that explains that. There's also nothing in terms of an appendices. So not only for me, but for members of the public or journalists, I think as a kind of principle across the council, we should have a kind of general approach whereby anyone could pick up the paper and understand, ideally acronyms, but particularly what that risk rating means. So just a plea for that for Audit Committee papers going ahead in future.
Thank you. That's a point that I completely understand. When I first started at the authority, and even now, to be honest, I have to go away and look for the document and try and understand what the risk rating is. My colleague Wayne in Democratic Services is actually looking at the template for reports and is issuing further guidance on that, and we'll make sure that there's a link included in the templates so that if anybody wants to look at the document setting out how we assess risk and what our risk thresholds are, that you can have easy access to that.
I sit on the Employment Matters Committee as well, and I know full well that Sam and the HR team do an extremely good job in communicating with all levels throughout the council. So when we come up with this, we have 2 whistleblowers this year and one this year and 2 last year. I know a lot of it is because Sam has done an extremely good job in communicating through all the offices throughout the council. So I know it's an HR thing. So we'll do the recommendations at 7.1 on page 33, which is the committee is asked to note the contents of the report. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Take item 7 on the agenda, which is the Interim Auditor's Annual Report. Now I'll ask Darren and Ibby to introduce this report. Welcome along.
Good evening, members. So this report before you is the first year of a value for money report under the new Code of Audit Practice. It requires us to consider the arrangements that you have in place across 3 areas: financial sustainability, governance, and economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And what we're required to do is to assess your arrangements and play back our views in a balanced format. So highlighting where we think you have appropriate arrangements in place and those areas where we feel that your arrangements could be improved. And to that latter point, we identify 2 types of recommendations really. Improvement recommendations, where we think your existing arrangements based on what you intended to do could be strengthened, or where we think best practice is such that your arrangements could be strengthened. And then the second area of recommendations is a key recommendation, and that seeks to address what's described under the Code of Audit Practice as a significant weakness in arrangements. So for those members that have been around for many years, you would have been familiar with either a qualified value for money conclusion, as in the past terminology, or an unqualified value for money conclusion. Having a significant weakness is equivalent to the old regime of a qualified value for money conclusion. And here at Medway, we recognise one significant weakness, and that's largely around the children's social services and draws on the findings from Ofsted. And we set those reasons out in this report. We're presenting this as an interim annual audit report, and the only reason we're doing that, I think most of the work that we're reporting on the value for money side is complete, but we can't quite finish the value for money side because there is a natural linkage with the work on the financial statements for 2021, which is still in progress. So we present it as an interim. If we If we felt there were value for money issues that arising from the financial statements audit that we needed to report to you and reflect in the value for money work, then we would reissue the auditor's annual report and give you a further update. With that, I'm happy to pick up any questions that members may have.
I'll open it up. Tristan.
Yeah. I've got a couple, but I'm going to take them in batches of 3, I think would be sensible. So my first one is just around, obviously, the executive summary, so page 42 in the pack that was sent to us. So the medium-term financial statement or financial planning, if I look at other public bodies, it is common that a medium-term financial statement is published in advance of a budget. In fact, it's seen as a working document by many public bodies. And many public bodies also give forecasts, and they give optimistic and pessimistic forecasts. As I understand it, a similar document was due to be published at Cabinet in September, but has since been withdrawn. I understand potentially the logic for that, but if such a public document was in circulation, has that been submitted to the auditors? Because presumably one was compiled for that September meeting. And if it hasn't, or has, why has it not been submitted to them for them to review? And I understand the issue around settlement grant, but that's still not a potentially sustainable answer because MTFS could include a pessimistic forecast within it. So that's my first question around that. I also have a concern how that links potentially with the other element that's mentioned around resources for the finance department. Is it part of this report that stipulates that there is potentially not adequate resourcing? And the two might be indeed linked, because if we haven't got the MTFS and it's not published, and it should have been, is that because of a resource problem? So the sort of lead on point from that is linked to that. So just a question about resource, if possible. My other one is concerning, and this is something which you might not be able to answer. So obviously I sit on Children's Committee. There is currently a proposal with the government at the moment, as I understand it, around the direct support grant, the high needs budget. Last week it was indicated that potentially it's sitting on a minister's desk. But I don't know if there's been some update on that. That is a significant sum of money. I raised concerns at Children's just around the sustainability of that financial document that you have referenced in here. Interestingly enough, the Council has gone through several iterations since that document has been published. In fact, has said that the original funding strategy behind that may not have been entirely accurate. So I'm just concerned around the direct support grant. And indeed, I think you've indicated your concern around that, because I understand on page, you've referenced this in terms of your very much concern on page 49, top right paragraph, where you've said, the statement of government support in the early stages of the recovery plan could potentially cause a Section 114 notice if indeed that sustainability is not acknowledged. And the question I have for you is that the reason why you are caveating your children's services response to us? Because there is potentially a budgetary concern around the DSG, around the support grant element there. So that's my second question. And my third question is more directed at the finance officer. Is there, when are we going to get the MTFS published? Because it really should now be in circulation. I am not comfortable as a member that it's not. I have concerns around why that has been delayed. And I would strongly urge that a document that should have been in Cabinet in September, if there is even a draft version in circulation, that at least be provided to the chairman and the opposition spokes. And would your consent, would you be willing to publish what you have to us as members to review, that even if that document is not finalised? Thank you very much. My first three questions. Thank you.
Katie.
Thank you, Chair, if I may. So, for many years, since I've been at Medway, we actually published a medium-term financial strategy in advance of the budget. So we've historically presented that to Cabinet in September and then turned it into a draft budget in November and then a final budget, obviously, in February. And we only shortened our planning timescale from 5 years to 2 as COVID hit, because the government were making one-year allocations, and frankly, at the beginning of COVID, I don't think we knew what the world was going to look like. So our planning assumptions, the only thing we knew about them was that they would be wrong. Yeah, you're quite right. Our aspiration has been for some time to stretch that planning horizon back out and to present a medium-term financial strategy, again, that sets out a 5-year planning horizon and as you say, presents some pessimistic and optimistic views. And we had intended to do that from last year, but then the government announced another spending round right on top of us planning to do that. So I think what we effectively agreed is that we will always produce something in the autumn in advance of the budget, but that actually we might be better placed to back our 5-year projections alongside the February budget, so that we're projecting in advance of the coming budget setting cycle. In terms of the report that we were, as you say, presenting to Cabinet in September, it isn't that report was withdrawn, it was that the meeting was cancelled. So the organisation took a view that following the death of the Queen, we wouldn't continue with publication of ordinary meetings and ordinary business, and so the cabinet meeting didn't happen, and so we didn't have anywhere to publish anything to. That report has obviously been updated and is going to the October meeting of the cabinet, which means it will be published on Monday. So our financial outlook for 23-24 will be published on Monday. So hopefully that answers most of the first question. In terms of whether we've got the sufficient resources in the finance department and whether that's had an impact, I think you'll be aware by the fact that I'm sat here with the title of Chief Finance Officer, and there is another head of sat to my left, Andy McNally-Johnson, who's now our head of corporate accounts. We've been through a restructure, and that's delivered a fairly significant saving in the current financial year, but it's also strengthened our management resource. So actually what that will enable us to do is to do more in the sort of thinking and planning and strategising and helping to make sure that this organisation is ready for whatever challenges come. But not at the expense of operational staff, I stress. That's actually being dealt with via our transformation programme. So there are things that we've had some vacancies, and we're working hard to automate some of the stuff that would have previously been done by FTE. So that's not actually a case of we're getting rid of anyone, obviously. And my team has grown, as this report actually notes. So our finance services are in a much stronger position now than they were when we commenced this audit. So whilst that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to kind of get back on track in terms of timescales for publication of our audit results, because obviously that's a whole different workload and series of complications, I don't think that the reason that we haven't been publishing 5-year projections is because of a lack of resources in my team, but I'm also confident that we're much better placed to do that work moving forward. You referenced the conversation at CYP on Thursday? I watched it, but I can't remember what night it was, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, government finance officer. I don't miss much. And so the conversation there is around, for anyone who's not 100% familiar, so there were some new burdens that fell to local authorities from 2014 in the sort of cohort of children with special educational needs that have to be supported from council funds, which were not met by sufficient grant funding. And I'm not saying anything that's not been nationally reported at this point. And that's left most upper tier authorities with problems on their what's called the dedicated schools grant, specifically the high needs block. And Medway, in common with most upper tier local authorities, actually has a reserve which is curiously sitting in a deficit position. So rather than being a balance that we can spend, it's got an overdraft effectively. And we're in conversations with the government about a scheme called the safety valve. I don't have a kind of concrete answer, and I'm not sure. I haven't spoken to Leanne since CYP actually, so I'm not clear whether we've got any more sort of concrete figures. But what I do know is that we're now in a position where we're moving forward with the government on the safety valve, which effectively contains that risk within the DSG and means that its impact on the general fund should be limited moving forward. So, and as Leanne said at CYP, we'll be bringing forward a report as soon as we're able to the relevant members and committees. And so, yeah, your last question, I think, was when will you get a 5-year set of projections? Well, you'll get our projection for 23-24, which makes some reference to future years on Monday, because that will be published for Cabinet. I think I'm right in saying Monday. Cabinet is, the following Tuesday, so that would be right. And our aspiration at the moment is to turn that into a set of 5-year projections to run alongside the budget that we present to Cabinet and Council in February. I think I've answered all your questions. Is that right? Or round one.
I'm going to ask round two. This is just a follow-up on round one. So just lastly, on your medium-term financial statement last time, there were some restructures compared to the previous one. So in some ways, money was moving between directorates, which didn't make clear whether or not that means that some directorates were basically inheriting a cut position. Can I just get some clarity that this document, if there are restructuring between directorates, that we get some clarity about how money is diverted between directorates more clearly? So I'll give you an example. I think the Regeneration Directorate last time inherited something from the Central Operations Directorate, which meant that they looked like they were getting a budget uplift, which was quite helpful for them. But the reality is actually it was due to a cut somewhere else that was moving money within the organisation. I think that's from memory, so I'm saying that as an anecdote as opposed to cast iron remember. But I do remember there was some restructuring around it, and that gave me a bit of concern that it was just moving money around directorates to try and potentially massage not to say massage, but try and make things, it was less that I can make comparisons with previous years, and of course the public should be able to do that. It's my question.
Thank you, Chair. It's absolutely never our intention to be anything other than transparent. So I can guarantee that a report coming from my team isn't trying to mislead or confuse. And so I think, because I can recall the situation that you're talking about, so we effectively lifted and shifted some of our services that were previously in the Business Support Directorate, and that's actually our property function, effectively, and our valuation and asset management service. And they were moved from business support into regeneration, as you say, which is in regeneration, culture and environment. And I think what that probably represented is that we moved the budget that we currently had in business support for those functions straight into regeneration, culture and environment. But what actually might have happened is, for instance, if a team had an income target that was no longer achievable, well, we also moved that no longer achievable income target. So they received the budget that we had previously to deliver that service, but also would have inherited any targets attributed to it. So that's the kind of anecdotal thing that I think I'm saying we might have done. What I do think I can promise to do or undertake to do is that when we publish our draft budget and our final budget, you'll be aware that over the last couple of years we've expanded the appendices, and so there's now for each directorate there are 2 appendices. One actually shows what our proposal for that budget for the directorate is split by service, but the second one also shows specifically the changes that we're making, so where we're reflecting budget growth as a result of pressures, but also where we're reflecting savings and what they're derived from. And so obviously I'll make sure that we work with the assistant directors to endeavour to make sure that that's as clear and transparent as possible in the draft budget that you'll see in November. Thanks.
Adrian.
This works. Oh, it does. Great. Well, as usual, very detailed and comprehensive document. Just one slight sort of housekeeping whinge. Could you increase the font size? Most of us are now doing this on electronic devices, and in the future, well, it's our ambition for after the election next year to go over to be completely paperless. It's an ambition that will, not only save the authority a lot of money, but it's also good for the environment. And at the moment, I don't know what it's like on other people's devices. In order to read it, I've had to shuffle the thing around the page. Get into more detailed. On page 55, it talks about governance and MDC. I have to say that some of the statements on that page don't reflect the reality as I understand it. In paragraph 2, it says, we note that the outcome, and they're talking about housing numbers, turned from red to green in the 2020-21 quarter 3 performance monitoring report, as 1,130 dwellings were completed through MDC group in the first one. I wish that was the case, but that I think was Medway Council, the Medway area entire housing, which is I think the highest we'd had for some considerable time. MDC did make a contribution to those 1,130, but it was a very modest contribution. It was 20, and that was the rented affordable accommodation, which is associated with our development at Garrison Point, which incidentally won a design award the other night, which is pretty good. The other thing that I'm a little bit, when they talk about there's been no report to the Overview Business Support ONS Committee. They may not have been to ONS, but certainly there would have been to the Regen Committee, because that's where that part of the Council's business does report to. Notwithstanding that, though, both Councillor Doe, who chairs the main board for MDC, and myself as the chair of one of the subsidiary companies, are held to account by the Business Support Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and members have the opportunity to ask questions. Certainly, when I was held to account last time by the Regen Committee, I was asked a lot of questions about MDC, and there was a section of my report to be held to account on MDC. That, in fact, I started my presentation, as it were, my being held to account by showing the fly-through that had been computer generated of Future Chatham, which showed all the MDC developments. So that sort of led me into quite a lot of detailed questioning. You've made a comment there about directors, and what is not reflected in it. Yeah, I fully accept that directors of a company have got to have a comprehensive and skill set that is directed towards the company. And yes, as a council member and a cabinet member, that doesn't give me the automatic knowledge. But what we've got in MDC, we've got two highly experienced non-executive directors that provide that outside knowledge and influence and long-term. In fact, one of them, Barbara Richardson, who unfortunately had to leave us last year, was involved in setting up the company. Barbara spent her whole working life in the development industry, both in the public and private sector. She's been replaced by Peter Sloan. Peter's expertise is in sales and marketing. As we've got to that stage, we're now selling and marketing our properties quite successfully. We are nearly just up to 70% of Garrison Point being sold off plan. We hope to get our first 40 residents in, if they wish, before Christmas. So the company will be cash flow positive for quite a while. So Peter replaced Barbara. The other non-executive director that's been there throughout the company is Jonathan Sadler. Jonathan was very much involved in the development of Chatham Maritime, so he's got a wealth of experience in the local property market as well as property market, property development generally. So that's where we get our skill base from, and those non-executives are extremely good at tempering the enthusiasm of particularly myself, who can possibly have too much enthusiasm. They are a very good backstop. Also, as far as the subsidiary that I chair, which is the property development, the actual building side, I chair it, but the other two directors on that are the two non-executive directors. So I would actually, if anything went wrong, be outvoted. So, that I think is a good thing. Also, it doesn't reflect the fact that before any financing is actually approved for drawdown, whilst it doesn't go to Cabinet, it goes to the leader and it goes to the Chief Operating Officer, who go through the business plan with great detail. So that is backside. We intend to take a more comprehensive report to Cabinet in future, and I take that on board. That's probably something we've not done. I think we're in debt annually at the moment, but I think, yes, I perfectly take that very much on board. So I think that's all I wanted to really say on that. But as I say, I think if you could, I'd just like to finish by saying that I would very much, this is not criticism, but it doesn't reflect what the reality is, but what I would really like you to do is come and see MDC and give us a forensic examination, if you wish, because we're part of the council's family. Very much accept that because it's 100% owned by the local authority, and it's public money that we've invested for the benefit of the people of Medway and to promote Medway's regeneration. And if there's any profit to be made, that will be ploughed back into this local authority, as it already is actually, as you will see when you get to the Treasury Management report later on this evening. You'll see that there's already a considerable contribution from MDC coming in to the council already. So please come and visit it. I mean, that's an open invitation, not some sort of formal recommendation from the committee, but please come and see us, talk to our Chief Operating Officer, and also the directors. Particularly, we would like to try and get the two non-exec directors along as well, because I think we've got a good story to tell. But if there's anything that you find that we're not doing right, we'd only be too pleased to, obviously take that on board and make sure, because I want to make a success of MDC, because I think it's playing a huge role in the regeneration of Chatham. with lots of projects. And just on that, when it comes to resources, I've got to say one of the problems is that we've probably been a bit too successful at the moment, and there has been a danger of mission creep. We've been asked to take on projects outside of what we're doing at the moment, and we've pushed back on that very, very firmly. We are firmly focused and concentrating on the projects that we're building at this moment of time, and we're not going to be diverted on other things. No matter, we have got the expertise within the team that's very good, that could do other projects, but we've got to deliver on the projects that we're delivering. So please come and visit us, Darren, and we would really welcome you, and and nothing to hide. Yep.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm sure that Darren and Grant Thornton will take on board what Adrian has said, and I'm certain that they will take up the opportunity to at least visit. Okay. Katie, it's over to you.
Thank you. I mean, Darren may well wish to comment, but I think I'll just point out that Councillor Golvin there has spotted something, an error that half of corporate management team failed to see when we cleared the version of this report. So, as Darren alluded to earlier, if we do have to issue a revised version of this, I'm sure we can incorporate any amendments like that. And just to draw the committee's attention to that recommendation that's alluded to there is actually on page 59 of the agenda pack. It's page 21 of the report. And all that we've committed to do is reviewing this recommendation alongside a recommendation we've actually had from internal audit about similar situation on Kindy, and that we've elected to take that forward following the election in May. Thanks.
Darren, you okay?
Thank you. Thank you for that. So, yes, if we've got some of those facts wrong around the outputs, we'll make those corrections. Appreciate that. We will probably decline your invite to forensically investigate the company. But I note the invite to come along and see the activities, so thank you for that. And we may well take that offer up. The recommendation around directors and cabinet members, all we were doing, we were trying to acknowledge the difficulty of those dual roles. We acknowledged the tensions that can emerge, and we were trying to take stock of some pretty high profile local authority companies that have failed, and just try to assess whether your arrangements are sufficiently strong enough to guard against those sort of risks, or as your scale of activity increases, that those risks don't become more prominent.
Yeah. Well, that's why we thought it was so important to have those non-executive directors on board from the word go. Because, yes, fully accept that as council you don't automatically have those business skills, and being a company director has responsibilities, all of its legal responsibilities as well, which are quite onerous, and have to, I didn't know how onerous they were going to be until I actually took it on. So I think there is probably a argument there for giving people who are going to be in that position in the future some training and support, because I think it goes over and above what is expected of a normal councillor, and I think people who are put in that position should have. I've had to learn it the hard way and quickly, but I think it would be, for people coming up behind, it would be much better if they were given a good induction and training, by probably somebody from outside that is more of an expert in that field. I think that would be a useful thing, and if you want to put that in a recommendation report, I think that would be, good for future use and governance.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Tristan, round two.
Thank you very much. And it does actually, part of the questions do follow actually on from what has just been said. So I just to go back to my first set of questions as well, just because I did mention the issue on page 49, which is the top right paragraph. There are which links to Medway would be unable to avoid presentation needing to issue a section 114. Now, whenever I see that in an audit report, that raises somewhat flags to me. So I just want you to clarify what exactly that means, just for public record, because clearly, as we move forward, I'm linked in with the MTFS. That sort of things begin to flag up. Now I know you've given me good answers on that, and that I'm happy with those. So I just wanted to clarify what that meant. My second question is linked to the housing infrastructure funding. Now, one of the caveat points here, you might not be aware of this, but there's significant rancour, I would suggest, around this HIF situation. And my query to you is, and to the finance officer, is what information are we providing to auditors this year on such a situation? And is it subject to, because clearly we're not moving forward at pace with that, and has that incurred already liability costs because we're not where we should be in terms of internally presentation. So I know there's consultations happening, so I don't want to prejudice those happening already, but I just wondered what the situation was with regards to that. My third point is just around, and there's a lot about MDC, and I have no allegations to make there, and I'm sure it's a bona fide organisation with fantastic non-executives, but there are a number of points here which shows, and the Croydon example I would use, but there are other examples, Thurrock, for instance, in solar panel and solar investments, have also gone the same way. And I note on page 54 that the loans are expected to grow to a sum £120 million. And my concern is, especially given the current housing situation, the inflationary crisis and other macroeconomic positions that are happening at the moment, my worry is around the housing market as a whole. There are some predictions it might decline by other values. So those people do need to be held accountable. And we do need to keep in my view, a tighter oversight of that organisation. That is not disparaging the work of people on there, but if we are investing as a public body into those organisations, and if independent recommendations are that we don't sit on those bodies because of even a potential conflict of interest, then I think we do need to pursue that quite aggressively and quite quickly. I note there have been in other papers that this may change in May anyway, but my question to you is could we do it earlier? Could this be recommended to Cabinet as an immediate situation where people do have to step down? Because I do think now, given some of the prominent issues in previous years with councillors and others involved in hands-off bodies, that actually we need to learn a lesson. And I think we need to move forward more quickly than that. So I just wanted to see if that was the case. And just my third question is around the workforce strategy. I'm trying to find the page for it. I think it's linked to page 48. So it says that an overarching workforce strategy document was not in place for 2020-2021, although we recognise that there are individual strategies which I'm hopeful have all come together to form an overarching workforce strategy. I'm just wondering, it says that they're currently being developed for future years. Clearly this was written maybe 6-12 months ago. Where are we with the workforce strategy? I say workforce, this is important for us, and potentially linking in with the MTFS as well, because where are we sitting in terms of children's services? It is identified that children's services are a net liability. I note the headcount for children's services is coming out of agency workers. That is potentially, they charge a premium of around 30-40%, as I understand, on current contractors. So I would strongly urge, if we don't have one, we really do need one, and we need to be reducing those agency costs. And I'm sure you know that as well as I do, because you're probably pushing back on those. But I was just wondering, does such a document, can we update us on the situation with that document? And is that going to be in alignment with the MTFS that we're going to be getting on Monday next week? Thank you.
Katie.
Thank you. Your first question, I think, was alluding to that paragraph that says, essentially, if we can't resolve the issues with the dedicated schools grant deficit, we may be in a position where we would need to issue a Section 114. I think that's the sort of statement that's in there. And so I think your question is, what does that really mean, right? And so the Local Government Act requires local authorities to set a balanced budget, i.e. one where our expenditure that's planned doesn't exceed the income that we're projecting for the same period. At the moment, our dedicated schools grant reserve, the high needs block, the deficit on that is some £20 million. And we've got a statutory override in place at the moment, which effectively means that we don't have to be able to offset that with general reserves, i.e. we can contain it. That statutory override is finite, and the government haven't made any noises yet as to whether they plan to be extending it. So we're looking at a situation where that we would need to be in a position where we've got enough general reserves to offset any deficit that's sitting on the DSG reserve. The safety valve process effectively buys us enough time, we and the government believe, to make enough changes to the way that we deliver that service to recover that deficit over the sort of medium to long term. And that, although obviously my esteemed colleagues from GT might feel slightly differently about this, that buys us enough run time to actually deal with that issue, and therefore it doesn't represent the problem in that we don't have to consistently hold enough reserves to offset whatever's sitting on that deficit. The reference to section 114 would be if any local authority were to find themselves in a position where it was simply unable to balance a budget, there's a responsibility of the section 151 officer to flag that to the government, to the public, to the auditors, and that's what that statement means. And so there are a handful of local authorities across the country that this has happened to, so Northants, the most famous, most recent one, there are others. But that's kind of a last resort for any local authority, and obviously we're in a position where we currently have sufficient reserves to offset that DSG deficit, so we're not in that position at the moment. We're working really hard to make sure that we can contain expenditure in the current year and put forward sensible, rational proposals for future years. So that's not in our thinking at the moment, but all the while there is a significant deficit position on a reserve. This report is citing that might be a risk, I think, for any organisation in that situation. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer. Your next question was about the HIF and what we're presenting auditors with in the current year. Well, the answer is anything they ask for, right? So the Code of Audit Practice says that if these guys ask for any particular document, we share it with them because it's our duty to make sure that they have open access to anything that they need to do to give the conclusions that this committee is expecting them to be able to deliver in that report. So I think that's probably the right answer. You've had everything that you've asked for, and I'm not, to my knowledge, we've not provided anything that you've asked for around that really key scheme in our capital programme. I think your next question was, could it be a recommendation for Cabinet members who are currently on the boards of our local authority trading companies to step down now or to accelerate that review? I mean, I'd have to kind of defer to governance colleagues, but I think I'm not clear whether Audit Committee has a right to make a recommendation like that.
I don't believe so, but it's something I'd have to look into, but I don't believe we do have that. No, we don't.
I'm not making that recommendation.
We don't.
Yeah. But I think what I will say on that, though, is that what this report is talking about here is there's no finding or implication that we have an issue or that anyone has acted in any way that isn't in the best interests of both the council and both those bodies. I think what the report is pointing out is that there is guidance out there which suggests that there may be a risk that somebody acting untoward could do something that isn't perhaps in the best interest of either party, and that there may be, you could reduce that risk by not having that twin role. But I don't think there's any accusation or any sort of inference in the report that there's any issue here. So rather it's stating a risk, which is a national risk in the guidance. And then finally, you asked a question about a workforce strategy. And so as the report concludes, we haven't got an overarching workforce strategy for all of Medway at this point in time. Our Chief Organisational Culture Officer has that on a kind of work plan for in development, but the key one that we do have is a Children's Services Workforce Strategy, and that's got some significant strands about how we make sure that we seek to reduce our reliance on agency providers for all the reasons that you've cited. It's not just cost, it's actually about making sure that children are placed with a social worker that they retain through their time in support of that service rather than having sort of chop and change. But that workforce strategy for children's services exists, but the kind of broader one is an aspiration and in development. We don't have that yet. Is that all right?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, can I come back on some of those points? Thank you very much. So just on the section 114, I appreciate your clarity on that. I will say that deficit reduction strategy on the DSG high needs has gone through several iterations at Children's ONS, and I'm myself not confident about the robust nature of it. So I'm going to leave that at that for other professionals present to perhaps deal with that. And clearly we're waiting upon the government's position on this, and it might be the case that this is dealt with by them, hopefully. But my worry is if they suddenly turn around and say, no, we're not touching it, thank you very much, and that might be something we need to be just aware of, and that worries me in relation to your announcement there. Because actually what you're saying is actually, while we technically in section 114, it is related to a very specific issue. So I'm not sure if those words, they might have scared me a bit more than they should have done, perhaps. I don't know if that's, maybe I'll say nothing more. Just on the, just secondly, I'm not proposing a recommendation on non-executives. My concern with all of these hands-off bodies, especially ones that link to property, I appreciate we've got specialists, you've named some, but the issue with properties, especially if there are local people who are specialists, is clearly they might have conflicts of interest. If we're selling assets and we're marketing assets in a locality, which they also happen to be property specialists in, it doesn't take a rocket science to say, well, wait a minute, what are these people really here for? Because if they could have a nearby property that might benefit them. So my concern around public probity, I think, is what this report kind of indicates. There just needs to be a greater level of probity. I'm not suggesting anyone is committing any offences. That's definitely not what I'm saying. And I'm sure the officers are fantastic and councillors are very strong. But my concern is just who sits on these boards, what links do they have? They might be property specialists, but is there any benefit in kind that but people could even probe or even look at? That is always my concern with third parties. And I do think these recommendations should be introduced next year, and I suspect they will be, because I think this report basically nails that coffin very much closed. And just lastly, on the workforce strategy, I appreciate what you said about children's services. That's not what this report is asking. It's saying an overall workforce strategy. Is that in your workflow? Or have you basically said we're not doing one? Because again, I would think that would be sensible to link with an MTFS so that we know what we're doing over the next 5 years. Are we recruiting more or less? And I think we just need to be honest about that. And I understand there might be trade union and workforce concerns, but from a strategic perspective, I think it would just provide clarity. And I just wondered why we haven't done it when it says kind of we need to for the overall organisation. So they're my just 3 push points.
Katie.
Thank you. So the deficit recovery plan and the various iterations of it, I think are partly it's a moving feast, right? The actual cohort of children that we're paying for, and as you've seen, our projections around what we're actually having to move into that reserve at the end of each year through our outturn reports is different from what we think it might be at the beginning of the year. So I think to some extent the kind of burden is continuing to grow, and I think we've still got another couple of years left before that sort of bubble of children that we have to support since the changes in 2014. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of who. Yeah, absolutely. They're just sort of, so I think to some extent once that settles, and I think we're very much near that now, that we'll be in a better place to actually, draw a line under one version of the plan and then deliver that moving forward. So I think you referenced that the way that the sort of Section 114 spectre is phrased in there is quite, perhaps a bit more scary than it needs to be. And perhaps that's the auditor's job, right, is to pose that challenge to us and to make us, really think hard on how difficult of a situation all councils are in, actually. And I think these are really scary times, right? Financially, for local authorities, we're in a really difficult place. So I think whilst that obviously is really scary, it's no more relevant for Medway than any upper tier authority in the country, actually. And I'm sure statements like that are probably replicated in reports like this across councils. But I think your question about a greater level of probity, I think that's exactly in line with what the auditors are saying, and our response to that recommendation is absolutely we'll review this in the next calendar year. And finally, in workforce strategy, I don't want to kind of pin a colleague to a task that I haven't actually confirmed with her, but Sam and I have had conversations where my understanding is that is a piece of work that she plans to do. But even if it wasn't already, I think the tone of this report suggests that that's a thing that we ought to be doing, and we would make it a priority even if it isn't. But I'm 80% confident it's already on her work programme, but the other 20% of me is saying I'm fairly certain Phil's going to make sure it happens anyway.
Before I allow Lawrence to come in, Adrian,
I'd like to come back
very
on.
brief, please.
Katie, when we discussed at Star Chamber the safety valve, I got the impression that there was some hope of government funding to help close it. From what you've just said, that's not the case, that we've actually got to make savings ourselves to actually reduce that. So did I get that wrong impression from Star Chamber?
Thank you. So, yeah, officers and members are meeting very frequently about that situation. It's probably got the closest level of scrutiny of any work programme in this place at the moment. And the truth's somewhere in the middle, right? So I don't think, whatever the conclusion of those discussions, and it is a kind of negotiation with the government about the level of support that will be given, I don't think there was ever an expectation that they would sort of ride in on a white horse and bail us out to the tune of the deficit. What the work programme suggests is that we will need to demonstrate that over a reasonable period of time, we can have a DSG, a send provision that is deliverable within the grant that we will get for each year. And to that end, my understanding is that we will be expected to resolve some elements of that deficit ourselves, but that there would be some financial contribution from the government. But like I say, until I see a confirmed report, I'm not prepared to comment any further.
On that. And just, I must go back to a probity issue because it's been alleged that the non-executive directors on the MDC may have a conflict of interest. That is absolutely not the case, because Jonathan Sadler, whilst he was deeply involved in the development of Chatham Maritime, that has been built out for many years. Jonathan no longer lives in Medway, he lives some considerable distance away, and to my understanding he has no current business connections within the Medway towns apart from MDC, and that also applies to Peter Sloan. Peter is not a resident of Medway, he lives a considerable distance away. We are just tapping on those people's expertise. They are paid for the role, by the way. They get a small amount of money for the time they spend with us. Councillor Dale and myself do not receive one penny.
Lauren.
Thank you, Chair. Just two questions, if I may. The first refers to page 53 in Grant Thornton's report, which says that internal audit has no formal role within any of the council's subsidiaries or joint ventures, but does reference a kind of deep dive review that was recently done on MDC. And to be honest, I don't know who this question is for, but the question is really then, how do we as members get audit assurance about those companies? So my expectation would be that there would be, audit assurance provided to the board, but how do we as councillors get an understanding about the robustness of the third line of defence within those companies? That's my first question. And my second one is, again, picking up this interest, this issue of members sitting on MDC and Kindy. And I guess I would just like to invite Grant Thornton to give their view of the, how happy or how comfortable they are with management's response to the recommendation that you've made there. As my colleague has highlighted, internal audit has made very similar recommendations. You've now made this recommendation that, there are some interest, conflict of interest risks potentially for members, and then also the question about whether, there's the appropriate skills sitting on that board as a result. We've also got best practice saying it's probably not a good idea. So I'm just kind of interested in how comfortable you are with that delay to the next election. And it isn't really clear to me, and maybe Katie would like to come in on this, why it can't happen sooner, what the reason is. Because I know you've said it's kind of a review, but when I look at the specific wording in management's response, it does seem a little bit more like you have accepted the recommendations. So say, in May 2023, at which point we will look to take on board the recommendations from the two internal audits, which are consistent with Grant Thornton's and also best practice. So I'm not sure, given the wording there, why that can't happen earlier. And in the last couple of days, we've also had notice that some of the memberships, as been alluded to earlier, have changed on both those boards. As far as I'm aware, we haven't been given a reason as to why that's happened. So I'm a little bit confused as to why change is happening on those boards, but it's not the change that's being recommended by internal audit, external audit, and bodies that, demonstrate best practice. Thank you.
Katie.
So I think your first question was around how this group or Medway Council receives audit assurance on the activities of our local authority companies. I suppose first thing to say is where those organisations develop to a significant size such that they need their own internal audit, then obviously that wouldn't be a matter for this committee, that would be a matter for the organisation itself to be operating properly in line with company law and whatnot. But obviously we're not there yet for those, as Councillor Goldwyn pointed out. MDC in particular is really tiny at the moment, despite having a relatively significant programme of work. James's team has a responsibility to Medway Council to provide assurance over the kind of governance framework at Medway, and that includes how our companies are governed, sort of to the extent that we have appropriate representation, i.e. we have a voice on those boards, and with the extent to which they interface between the council, so how the council has made decisions about establishing those companies or amending those companies, or how the council makes decisions to what extent we lend to those companies, for instance. They're all sort of risks that internal audit can review in terms of how the council is managing those companies. But obviously those companies are independent beings, and so if they require internal audit, it wouldn't be independent if we provided that, actually. So the extent to which you all get what you would consider internal audit assurance, the like of which James gives me for my team, right? So he'll do reviews of my functions and he'll tell me whether my policies are appropriate and whether people are actually following them in practice. But that activity would be for that company, which we have to be clear is a distinct body from Medway Council. Is that a bit clearer? Not sure if I've not just confused further, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the papers seem quite clear, and I understand that it's a separate entity, but the council has a financial investment that it's made in those. So surely we then have an interest in making sure that they're being run appropriately, and that have robust kind of, controls, which is what audit is opining on. So my question is, how do we then as a council get comfortable that those companies are being run properly?
So that's kind of through our ordinary governance process. So we do have members on the board, and there are reports to our committees on the activities of those companies. I think also we've worked really closely with them from an accounts point of view to make sure that their accounting policies and periods are brought into line with ours, so we understand how they're putting their books together. The statements that the team are currently working on is the first step where we'll be producing group accounts, which actually seek to present the transactions that those companies are delivering alongside our own, so that when this committee eventually receives that statement of accounts, you'll see all of that activity together. So that obviously is another sort of step forward into that transparency. I think what might be useful is to understand kind of some specifics, or so if perhaps we had a conversation about what it is that you like the committee to see, and we can see where that falls in line with our governance framework, because I feel like intuitively the council has a set of governance frameworks which are set out in the constitution, which we talked about in the first item, actually, the annual governance process, and there's probably a route through all of that would give you the information, or that the organisation's governance framework thinks that this body needs to do its job properly. And I think, if we found something that wasn't appropriately covered, then I'm sure we'd seek to correct that.
Yeah, it's just literally who is opining on the control environment within those organisations, and to who.
So internally, it would be them, and only to the extent that they're.
So we as a council will be taking comfort from the fact that we have people who sit on those boards, and is the reporting mechanism back to the wider council, or is it just that we're sort of devolving that to the people who sit on there? And do they report back to Cabinet? Do they report back to the council?
They do, I believe, via BSD-ONS, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then just your second question there, about just why we wouldn't bring that review forward. And I think I'll just go back to the fact that the report is fairly clear to me that we're not suggesting that there's a problem or that anyone is acting inappropriately. And to that end, whilst we recognise there's a risk, it's not considered significant enough, and our external auditors aren't advising us to do anything about it now. They're saying that we should be reviewing this, and obviously they're content with the recommendation that we've put in this report, or they would have pushed back, I'm sure, on our response. And I think to that end, there's a natural point in time next year when we will need to review the membership of those bodies anyway, and so I think that feels like a sensible point, rather than throwing a lot of unnecessary change at what is quite a small organisation in terms of its steerage, I think.
Okay.
I'm going to bring this to a close. I'm going to ask Adrian just one more
just
question.
Come back again on the probity, because there was an inference made there that there was something not quite right about having a change of non-executive director. we had one change in the 5 years that the company's been running, and that's that unfortunately we had Barbara Richardson resign last year. The reason Barbara resigned was that she has been given a new role. She is the managing director of a new property development company that's been set up by a large financial institution, and that financial institution, as part of contract, said that they should have no outside directorship. So regrettably, Barbara had to resign, which was a great shame because she had a huge amount of experience. Nothing wrong there. That's a normal sort of thing that happens in business, and as I say, we took the opportunity to use that as an opportunity to get a new set of skills in that we didn't have such a skill base for, which was the sales and marketing, and that's where Peter came in, because he spent a lot of time in sales and marketing, and we've now reached, as I said earlier, the sales and marketing stage of development. That having that skill on the board was a good thing to do. So we took the opportunity of although it was regrettable to lose Barbara Richardson, I've got to say it was like sitting next to a firework on the meeting with her, spouting out ideas. It was absolutely brilliant. But Peter's brought another skill set that we needed, which is more needed now, in that we've got to the stage where it's important to have sales and marketing, which has been highly successful. I said to have nearly 70% of your first development sold off plan at this stage before anybody else has moved in is exceptionally good. Most developers would be very happy to have 50% off plan.
Thank you. Okay. And that's what I'm going to call to close. We've got a lot of other things to get on with. I'm going to go to... That's going to be the last question.
Oh. Just another question. Darren, I mean, the council being the shareholder, are you recommending that the shareholder do not have representation on these boards? Is that what the recommendation? I understand from your recommendation, you highlighted there's no significant weakness, but you somewhat suggesting that there's conflict. So I just wanted to understand that, because I know in most organizations, you expect the shareholder to be sitting on the board.
Darren, if you would just answer that question, please.
Don't breathe on it.
So I think SITFA's best practice does push authorities more along the line of having two distinct functions. I can't confirm that 100% categorically, but that's my recollection. I think that's probably an ideal state. I think what we're recognizing here is that you need to ensure that the board of the company itself has the sufficient skill set, and acknowledge that where you've got a risk of the cabinet and the authority overseeing the subsidiary, that you're not merging the responsibilities of individual members with their role of directors, and wearing those two hats can at times cause potential conflict. So we're acknowledging the risk, and as I say, I think the recommendation is trying not to have that dual function, but I'd have to absolutely confirm that and come back to you on that.
Okay. Right. I'm going to go to the recommendations, which is recommendation at 7.1 on page 38, which is the committee is asked to note the content, recommendations made and management responses in the interim auditor's annual report from the council's external auditors, Grant Thornton. Is that agreed? Thank you, members. We'll go on to item 8, which is the audit progress report and sector update for the year ending 31st of March 2021. And over to you again, Darren and Ian.
Thanks, Chair. So the report before you is our audit progress for financial year 31st of March 2021, as well as some sector updates there. So the content of the report introduces me as the engagement manager, taking over from Ade, who you might be familiar with, from our audit plan in March 2022 when that was submitted. We also set again our auditor's responsibilities and as well as our deliverables, our dates that we aim to deliver some of our key items for the audit. Moving forward, we also report here our interim audit results. So our interim audit took place from March 2022, I believe, to around April 2022. And we set up our recommendations as well as our conclusions from this interim work. And then the pages following downwards are just some sector updates on our opinion on the Levelling Up white paper, as well as some reports on Prudential Code and the Treasury Management Code. I think that's where I would stop on that report. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Evie. I'm going to open the floor up. Any questions?
Just a quick one. I welcome the introduction of group accounts. I look forward to seeing those. Just in terms of how that's going to be presented, obviously I've seen group accounts before. Are we going to get separate documents, or is it going to be how are we? I mean, it might be a scope of a conversation that's happening now, how it's going to look. But there are multiple ways of presenting group accounts. So I was just quite keen to get your thoughts on where our current thought processes are. Thank you.
Andy.
Thank you, Chair. So the group accounts will be part of our overall account set. So it'll be presented, the single entity accounts will be there, and then one of the sections will be group accounts that follow that. So it'll just be all part of the one large document, but it'll be obvious what they are. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it will present the equivalent of the core statements for the group, and appropriate notes where there are material amounts or we feel it would be beneficial to the reader.
If I could just come back on that, because clearly my colleague has asked a question about the scope of our financial probity of these organisations, and clearly they have their own external audit function, and they'll be going to external auditors themselves, I'm assuming. So the extent of our group account function, I'm assuming that will reference the fact that that there are other external audit reports from these organisations, and that these are the standard positions of those organisations. Because I'm assuming also that you mentioned there's an alignment in terms of reporting. For instance, our accounts won't be delayed because of some significant problem with their accounts. So, because we've had qualitative statements before, we couldn't publish our accounts, I think, 2 years ago, because of qualitative statements around assets, I think, at the time, about valuation of assets, if my memory is correct. So, for instance, if you are holding a group accounts, you're presumably all those accounts have been agreed and externally audited and signed off. And could there be liabilities around that problem with? And again, I'm just future scoping what the potential risks could be of having group accounts versus our current standard format.
Thank you, Chair. So with regards to the subsidiaries being audited, Kindy do have an audit that takes place, so they produce their own financial statements and they are then audited, so we have that. Currently, MDC do not have their financial statements audited, and it's due to the size of them. So at the moment, obviously, a part of us producing those group accounts and the working papers that we have, and we work incredibly closely with the finance leads at both our subsidiaries. We obviously gain assurance from the information we get from them, and obviously within our statements, Grant Thornton will obviously have their own assurance that they need to get from those. Obviously that is potentially assisted if they have an external audit that has happened. But again, I think we're working within the regulations currently that we need to do. And if there is with regards to the size of MDC, or it increases, or it's decided that there should be a different route they go down. Obviously, that's something that will be considered through normal governance routes.
Sorry, apologies, Mr. Chairman, again. Just to clarify, you just said MDC is not externally audited, because I think that was a comment that my colleague mentioned earlier about internal oversight of MDC, which means that effectively we are the internal oversight over MDC, if I'm reading that correctly. So therefore, we should be seeing, potentially we do have access to their accounts. I know they're a small organisation, but that kind of I'm just asking the auditors, isn't that unusual? Because they're taking a significant amount of loans from us. They are a hands-off body. Is that not unusual to have them? I mean, I don't mind that they're audited by us, but I'm sure that is that not unusual? I would consider that maybe a bit strange.
Katie.
Thank you. I mean, Darren and Ibby might want to comment, but I think for me it's a timing issue. So MDC started very small, and the accounts in question we're talking about relate to a period before they took on significant assets and before the majority of the borrowing that we've made to them. And so in future years, they might well hit that trigger where they need to have their own external audit. Now, below a certain size, organisations aren't mandated to have an internal audit, but that's something that we might consider, or they might consider, if we think that's appropriate. And what I will say is, as Andy said, we've got really close, open working relationships with the finance teams at both of those organisations. And I think if we ever felt that we weren't in a position where we could access the information that we needed, we'd be raising that via external audit, via the members on the board, or via this committee, via some route, to make sure that we let the organisation know that that was an issue and corrected it. But at the moment, we're in a really comfortable place where they're sharing everything that they need to with us. And so as Andy said, our ability to put that stuff into our own statements and feel assured that it's correct and a true value, then is pretty good, I think. Yeah.
Adrian.
I think it needs to be pointed out that MDC does have its own accountants. We employ a local firm of accounts, so there is a separate body. You know, we don't obviously keep our own books, but those books are then audited in a way. It's not a formal audit, but as any organisation, you employ accountants to make sure that your books are in order. And a part of that normal accountant's function is a bit like our auditors do. If you're not meeting certain requirements, they would point it out to you. So, again, that's as I said, I'm very happy for anybody to look at the books. There is absolutely nothing wrong with them.
I'm certain at the end of the day, with the good work that the finance team have done here, they were highlighting the issues. Right, I'm going to go to the recommendation, which is 7.1. The committee asked to note the current content of the audit progress report and sector update from the Council's external auditors, Grant Thornton. All agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Take item 9 on the agenda, which is the Treasury Management Outturn Annual Report, which is on pages 95 to 114. And I'm now going to ask Jonathan Lloyd to introduce this report.
Thank you, Chair. This is the report covering the Treasury Management activity for the year ending 31st March 2022. At the next committee, I'll be bringing a report on the mid-year report, which will update us on the progress since then. Just a few things to note in the report. Capital expenditure was £84 million over the year, and that compared with the figure of £159 million, which is what we put in the strategy that was our view before the start of the year. That's what we thought we would spend. So about half of what we planned to spend. The net borrowing was therefore 219 million compared with an expected 387 million. And that difference is partly because of capital expenditure and partly due to just the vagaries of cash flow over the course of the year. Our borrowing does remain below the capital financing requirement. One thing that I'm sure you will have noticed is that we actually had £70 million worth of borrowing that is maturing in 2022-23. However, I just note that that's currently down to about 35 million as I speak at the moment. The reason that we've got so much maturing in that relatively short period is because we've been, although I've always said that my aim in life is to try and have a smooth maturity profile, I thought we didn't have huge spikes in any particular year. The council, as you're aware, has been under significant pressure on the revenue side, and one of the ways to keep costs down has been to borrow for the shorter periods. Longer term borrowing has always been more expensive than shorter period, but I do apologise. I'm very sorry that I did not anticipate interest rates rising so far and so fast as they have done recently. But, however, having said that, with interest rates being as high as they are, now it's not a good time to be taking out very long-term borrowing. And in fact, our advisors, Link, are still advising that we use short-period loans where necessary. So that's what we are continuing to do. And the only other thing that I've noted that you might want to note is that the value of our property fund portfolio is now £25 million compared with the original cost of £21.5 million. That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, so I'll be happy to take questions.
I'm going to open up to the floor. Lauren.
Thank you for that. Just a quick question, really, of clarification on the updated figures you gave for the debt repayments that are due this financial year. That 70 million that's gone down to 35 million, is that because of debt repayment, or is that debt refinancing, or a combination of both? Thank you.
It would be a combination of both. What I've tried to do in the amounts that are being repaid, I've tried to have it for we've got a little bit maturing in most months, and depending on how the cash situation is going in the month of repayment, sometimes I'm just able to repay and we don't need to take any replacement borrowing that month. Other times I have had to replace it, and I've done it for periods of up to 2 years. I've not gone much beyond that because I am trying to keep costs low, but you'll see in greater detail when we get the mid-year report, which I say will be coming to the next committee meeting.
Justin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So a couple of questions again, 2 tranches. I'll do my first 3 first. So on 4.6, you've indicated an MRP position. This also links to 11.2, so page 107 and 98. It says that Link Asset Services has identified historic errors in the calculation of CFR and therefore MRP provision. Can you just give me some clarity? What does that mean? What errors were highlighted? Because whenever something is an error, and I see there's significant variation on 11.2. So if I go to 11.1, a surplus of 5.4 million over its targeted budget of 12.17. So clearly this has had a material impact. How on earth have we? What error is this? Is this our fault? Is this someone else's fault? Is this something that's happened at a national level? Because and it might be not our fault, but that is something that's of significance to me. So some clarity on that. Second of all, and I've sat on this committee a number of years, it's short term. I remember a time when we said we wouldn't do any short term borrowing, and that was our aspiration many years ago. And I noticed on the future prediction around interest rates is up to 5.8%. Now, obviously, that is forecasts rather than, given the situation with market volatility, presumably borrowing is going to become extremely expensive. And that brings me on to my next point, the stress testing. Your team right now, I know it's mentioned in here, stress testing is occurring 6.2.3. It mentions that we don't have sufficient cash balances to place deposits for longer than a month. So clearly there's identified risk there. And that the stress testing by regulators is evidence of how institutions are going to cope. Can I ask, secondly, are we doing stress testing on our current position based on the predictions around forecasts over the next short term, as in next 6 months? Because clearly the Bank of England, I'm not forecast, but they've already said, they've been open about this, that they're expecting a big rate increase potentially in the next couple of weeks or a month. And also where we are going forward, are we going to be doing more stress testing around that? Because I'm just concerned about whether or not we need to change our approach around borrowing and whether or not that's featured with you. It might be too soon. And just my third question is just on, where was I? Sorry. The money market funds. I know property funds are something I've highlighted in the past. I'm very glad they're making significant profits, and that's positive. Though I am concerned about where this is going in the future, just around property fund valuation. So it might be that might dip. But more importantly, money market funds. I'm always concerned about equities. I know you have given caveats around money market investments as to why, but just to say, it appears we've had a big increase in money market exposure. I know it's as a proportion of the budget, it's very small, but if I'm right, and I might be reading this wrong, but on 5.5, it seems to have the actual exposure is significantly up in terms of value. So whilst as a percentage it's small, we are seeing using money markets. I just want to know why has that decision been made, and is that not a bit risky to be going down that route when I thought when we discussed previously we're going to try and avoid money markets, as I understand. So just those 3 questions for my first tranche.
Okay. First of all, on the MRP, I think perhaps the word error is a bit alarmist. We commissioned a report from Link to actually look at our methodology for providing MRP. And if you remember, as a result of that report, we switched from the old-fashioned 4% per annum based on the CFR to an annuity style of provision. Now, when Link actually did that report, they identified that some years back, and we're talking about the early 2000s, we actually over-provided. And as a result of that, they identified that cumulatively we'd over-provided something like £18 million. And we have been clawing that back by effectively giving ourselves an MRP holiday. And that's been over the last 2 or 3 years. We are due to, I think the last of that expires in the current financial year. So we've got a bit more to offset this year, and thereafter we'll be back to business as normal, if you like. So if you want to use the word error, it was an error in our favour, as it were. We'd actually sort of we've been able to sort of prop up the revenue budget by taking advantage of reversing that. You asked about. I'm sorry, I've probably scribbled these down in the wrong order and in insufficient detail. In terms of interest rates, at the moment the expectation is that interest rates will peak next summer. That is what our advisors are telling us. They also told us they weren't going to rise as fast in the first place, so I don't know. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. If I knew exactly what was going to happen with the economy, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now. I'd be drinking champagne on my wife's second best yacht or something. But unfortunately, we are where we are. In terms of the stress this may take us, we are within our monitoring procedures. We are looking at what interest rates are likely to cost us. We're looking at the impacts of having to renew loans as they become available. The impacts of what the capital programme is happening. We're firming up on our procedures for monitoring the capital programme. Part of the reorganisation is putting in a stronger team to keep a check on that, because one of the things that does cause me difficulty in producing Treasury reports is knowing exactly what the profile of the capital spend is. You know, as I said in the introduction, we spent about half what I said we would do when we put the strategy together, because that was the best information we had at the time. Was that, you know, most of our schemes were going to deliver within a relatively short period, and obviously, you know, the slippage within that, and they don't necessarily all happen at the time that we had been led to believe. So I think that's probably all I can say about that. And yeah, do you want to ask your follow-on with that immediately?
So, so yes, if I can, just on the two points. So my second question was related to stress testing. So the query I have is, we are expecting interest rates to go up. There is significant evidence of short-term borrowing. I appreciate Link, who have a mixed record, as you just said, might be right, might be wrong, but surely there might be some prudence in saying, right, we might take a longer-term, larger loan if we're expecting short-term borrowing costs to go up significantly. So we don't effectively are in a position next year where we are short-term borrowing constantly on very high rates. Does that make sense? So
yes.
My thing is, do we consolidate this in one big long-term loan now, while interest rates are potentially lower, rather than continue to speculatively go to the short-term market? So I'm just interested that Link have said no, stay with the short-term borrowing, because actually that to me sounds a bit counterintuitive, but clearly they know better. So that's my first point. And the stress testing bit, clearly we don't know what interest rates are going to do, so in terms of our capital position, and I'm also worried about that, because if we're borrowing to invest in capital, clearly you are going to have to produce optimistic and pessimistic forecasts of where we're going to be, and that's very difficult. And my query is that being taken into account when you're presenting financial data on, say, HIF funding, or maybe not HIF funding, but other funding that we are taking from the private sector? Does that make sense? Sorry, yeah. Have I made that?
I'm probably going to take this in the wrong order, but in terms of you know, whether we're presenting different scenarios in terms of what the costs might be on the, you know, the existing capital programme going forward, yes, we are absolutely doing that, and that's discussions that we're having on almost a daily basis at the moment. It's sort of, you know, number one on the agenda. In terms of should we take a nice big loan out now at rates on the basis that they might go a bit higher? Well, they might go a bit higher, and we you know, we have a feel as to, you know, how high they might go, and you'll have seen these in the headlines. These are the sort of figures that are being bandied out. You know, perhaps expecting a 6% bank rate, you know, within the next year, but thereafter, the general consensus of opinion is that they will ease, not back to the levels that we've seen in recent years, but they will ease. So I could be making a big mistake if I was to take out a 50-year loan now at what we think is a better rate than we'll get in you know, 6 months' time, but we're then stuck with that for 50 years. Because we can't have an audit committee without mentioning Lobos, can we? And
that's my next point.
An audit committee meeting would not be an audit committee meeting without talking about Lobos. But if you think about what happened in the early 2000s, they took out these Lobo loans at what they then thought was a very good rate. And when I joined this council in 2013, we had loads of cash. And part of the reason that we had loads of cash is that we'd borrowed well in advance of need, which is something that's very much frowned on now. But they thought they'd got this war chest of cash, which indeed they did. But you're having to lend that out at lower rates than you're actually getting. So it's not something we want to do. And also, those rates which looked very attractive at the time have not looked so attractive in recent years. So it is a balancing act, and we do have limits on, you know, we have a £100 million limit that we won't go over. And I'm always very conscious as we start getting towards that, and 70 million is about as high as I really want to go, because I always want to leave that little bit of room that if we did have a sudden borrowing requirement, you know, one of the projects progressed quicker than I thought it was going to be, and I suddenly needed to take out a loan, I'd like to be able to do that within our short-term borrowing position to give me time to evaluate whether we then wanted to renew that, perhaps in a month or 2 months' time with a long-term loan, or whether that was just a little blip. Have I covered the points?
You have.
Sorry.
You asked about money markets.
Oh yes, sorry, money markets. Thank you for that. The reason that we hadn't got a lot, and we only use the one money market fund. And don't forget, we've not got, 50p is a lot of money in my book, but we've not got a lot of money to play with. We've only got basically day-to-day money. The only non-day-to-day money we've got is the money that we've got invested in the property funds, and that's a relatively modest amount. We are just using short-term, day-to-day money, and at the moment, the best place to support that is in money markets. They're paying much more attractive rates than the banks are. They're still not great rates, but they're better than they were. But it's all very short-term, and we are transacting with that money market on an almost daily basis, because it's our first port of call as to where we put money. And every morning we're looking at what's our cash position, and are we putting money into that today, or are we taking money out of that today? Yeah, it's relatively modest amounts that we're investing, and we went through a due diligence process when we actually sort of set up our account with this particular fund, and I think that's about all I can say on this.
Katie.
Just briefly, I just wanted to sort of draw us back to the thing that Jonathan pointed out right at the beginning of that, is that what this budget primarily represents is financing our capital programme. And so what we're also acutely aware of, Jonathan alluded to, our projections, which we do through our budget monitoring, but also in our sort of preparation for the coming year budget, have got that sensitivity analysis in there about what might rates do, and what we're trying to profile what our capital programme looks like. But ultimately, if we've got business cases that are based on the cost of borrowing at a point in time, and that might not be deliverable, then we would need to be looking as an organisation across. We can't just look at Treasury in isolation, and I think that's why we can't necessarily leap to take lots of borrowing in advance if we're not confident that actually we ought, I don't know, pause, reduce, perhaps review when or how some of that programme is delivered. So I think that's what I just wanted to say on that. And the other thing I think is that whilst we're acutely aware that we've been borrowing short for some time, and I stand by all of our decisions to do that, and there is a sort of a part of your brain that thinks, well, ought we pay a little bit more to borrow for a little bit longer? But actually, we have to balance that with that cost would ultimately mean that we will not be able to deliver something else through our revenue budget. And so it's the two are really interlinked, and we need to minimise the cost of borrowing as far as we can possibly do, whilst obviously making sure that we don't stitch ourselves up for the future. But we just have to be really mindful of the potential impact that might have on our ability to service our revenue expenditure budgets, right? And ultimately, if we needed to spend an awful lot more, if there was a world in which we wanted to secure our borrowing for longer term at higher cost, that would ultimately manifest in a cut in another service, which is what we've sought to prevent.
Agent, did I say?
Yes, Jonathan, could I ask, is it in table 11.2, the top line, is that where MDC's contribution to the council's finances is hidden? Because MDC has been paying interest at 8% during this period, and the council was borrowing it, I believe, at just under 3 at that time. So is that where it's hidden?
Thank you, Councillor Gelvin. We never try to hide things from members or the public or anybody else that wants to know. And yes, the interest from MDC will be within that line of interest earned. Can I just comment on the 8%, because I think you said that we're lending it to MDC at 8% and it's costing us somewhat less than that. And the reason for that is that we are inhibited by state aid rules, and I think that's an out-of-date expression now, isn't it? There is a new expression for that means state aid, but it's not state aid. Yeah. And I've been racking my brains for the last hour trying to remember what it is, and have completely failed. But it's the same thing. And basically, what that means is that we cannot give unfair advantage to an organisation by we've got to effectively add a bit of risk premium onto what our cost is to avoid falling foul of those rules. And so that's why the rate is what it is. Okay.
Subsidy control.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, members. I'm going to go to recommendations at 13.1 on page 108, which is the committee is asked to note the Treasury Management Outturn Annual Report. We all agreed? We agree. Thank you, members. I'm now going to call a 10-minute comfort break. Okay, thank you and welcome back. Now take the next item on the agenda, which is item 10, which is the internal audit update report, 1st of April to the 13th of August 2022, which is on pages 115 to 148 of the agenda. And I'll ask James Larkin to introduce this report. James.
Thank you, Chair. The report at Appendix 1 is the first update on progress for 22-23, detailing the work of the team, as mentioned a moment ago, from the 1st of April to 31st of August, and focuses on our plan for Q1 and Q2. I'll briefly take you through a few key points. The Section 4 on page 121 of your pack shows how our resources have been used over the period, and also details the impact on resources created by staff sickness, a period of vacancy, and also the unpredicted overrun of work from 21-22. Full details of the reviews from 21-22 that have been finalised since our last report to the committee and the progress against the 22-23 plan can be found in the tables at section 5, starting on page 123. As you'll see, all bar one of those reviews from last year have been finalised, but this should hopefully be resolved by the time of your next update. The tables on page 137 detail the other assurance and consultancy activity that has been undertaken by internal audit. And an update against the team's key performance indicators for this reporting period is provided at section 6 of the report, which starts on page 138. We've made reasonable progress against the agreed plan, with 13% delivered and a further 10% underway as of the 31st of August. It should be noted that these outturns are based on the number of reviews we expected to undertake, with the resource projected to be available at the start of the year, so there will be some fluctuation. As of today, I can tell you that IA 9A, which relates to the proportion of agreed assurance assignments delivered, is now 15%. And 9B, which is assignments underway, is now 18%. Section 7 on page 139 contains a request for amendment to the plan that was agreed for Q1, Q2. The audits in question are no longer suitable to go ahead, and they help to account for some of our lost resource, although a further part of that lost resource is reflected in the number of reviews listed in the plan for Q3, Q4, which is on the agenda later. Finally, Section 8 of the report provides an update in relation to all agreed actions in the table commencing on page 140, and the second table on page 146 details actions outstanding more than 6 months after their agreed implementation date. Members will note that an update has been provided by the service about their progress with this action. I'm happy to take any questions members may have.
Thank you, James. Lauren.
Thank you. I've just got two substantive questions, then one on sort of presentation of information that maybe we could take after other people have come in. The first two, earlier the Grant Thornton report noted there were cash flow risks that were associated with the HIF. And then I saw on page 134, coming to your report, that you're still in the position where you're drawing up the terms of reference for the project management audit on HIF. And I think we discussed this at the last meeting, because that was the status update that was given when we last met in June, that the terms of reference was being drawn up. And I think during that meeting I did make the point that there was a lot of member concern about the ability of that project to deliver on time and to within budget, and that I thought that that was a real priority for us to see that and get an understanding of what that was going to cover, and obviously its findings. So could we get a progress update on that? Is it still in the case that it's in terms of reference being drawn up, and can you sort of explain why that hasn't really moved on since June? And then my other question related to page 138, the proportion of staff in internal audit with a professional qualification that was relevant to internal audit was a bit concerning to me, with only 25% against a target of 65%, and would be interested in comments you have about what's being done to address that. Thank you.
James.
Yeah, no problem. With regards to your first question, obviously we have to work with the service to conduct these reviews. The the process to draw up the terms of reference, obviously the auditor conducts some initial research and then meets with the service. The review was scheduled, I think the early meetings were supposed to take place around July, August, but there was a delay. The meeting with the service got pushed back, not by us. Unfortunately, the circumstances dictated it had to be moved. So the auditor that's dealing with that particular review is obviously still sorting out those meetings and getting that finalised terms of reference so that we can move the review forward. In terms of the proportion of staff with professional qualifications, you may recall from earlier meetings we used to have officers in multidisciplinary roles. We've moved to single disciplines. We've currently got 2 officers on the apprenticeship, one of whom is due to finish within the next few weeks. So assuming she passes her endpoint assessment, she will be qualified. The other officer that was on that has unfortunately had to take a break from learning for personal reasons, but she will continue that. We have just appointed an apprentice. They will go straight onto the apprenticeship as well. The difficulty we have with recruitment at the moment is trying to. There are recruitment issues with internal audit and finding qualified people. So while some members of the team who have been in the team for quite a number of years certainly predate me, they ended up in there through redeployments and things like that. So while they don't necessarily have the qualifications, they do have a lot of experience, but we are working to address it. We're making use of the apprenticeship levy, and we're also exploring other avenues as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. If I could just come back on the first point, have the service that have kind of pushed these meetings back on the HIF terms of reference, have they given you a reason as to why they've had to push that back so significantly?
I don't know off the top of my head. Obviously, the auditors are responsible for undertaking the reviews themselves. It's certainly something I can look into. I think it's just availability of officers and things like that at the moment, but I can certainly look into that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is some concern, and yeah, if they're sort of not able to meet even with the auditors to agree of terms of reference for the audit, it does kind of raise red flags, to be honest, and maybe something that I pick up in regen. Thank you.
Lauren, I'm sure James will come back to you on that one as well. All right. Tristan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, a comprehensive report. And one of the questions has been dealt with around staffing, and resources, because I think that has been an issue of concern I've raised a few times, but not related to necessarily loss of resource, but because of the situation with COVID. This is obviously a non-statutory function, so this is good that you are internally training people up, and I think that is necessary. Just in terms of, and I also note some of the consultancy work that you've taken on, and thank you for that, and I look forward to seeing sort of an update on that at some point as well. So just in terms of, just in terms of previous years, I seem to remember 4 years ago we had a joint committee with Gravesham Council. I know I've raised this, I think 2 years ago I raised it pre-COVID, but it'd be quite helpful if we could do something similar again, just because this is a joint service, and whilst we are not, Gravesham Council is a separate authority and it has its own positions, I'd be quite keen to get a joint view about the service from them as well, to see if it's working. Maybe if these sort of joint services arrangements that we have with Gravesham can be extended in other areas, perhaps a consideration of that in future might be something that may be worth looking at. And similarly, I know we do a lot of work as well with other local authorities and legal services and communications. I understand that too. So I don't know, is there something that we could look at in relation to that now COVID is done? Maybe if we have a similar arrangement that we had 4 years ago where we all come together and just look at you as an overarching body of staff and your response and how you're delivering with them as well as us. And I think that'd just be good practice given it is a joint service and a joint arrangement. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I know they hosted it last time. I don't know if that might be something we can reciprocate this time. Yeah, just that question.
For members' benefit, one of the things we do is we actually conduct an annual review of the shared working arrangements. So there are discussions between the two Section 151 officers We look at key objectives for the operation of the shared service. Are we meeting those objectives? And those have obviously been updated and changed because a lot of them still related to the main drivers for creating the shared service, you know, around delivering cost savings and things like that. Well, those have been achieved, so we've kind of updated the key objectives. In terms of the joint committee meeting, it would, colleagues from Democratic Services would probably advise me on this, but I believe it would have to be an informal one. There are a lot of hoops to jump through if it was to be a joint formal meeting. But last time it was an informal meeting and it followed our external quality assessment. Coincidentally, we are due to have that scheduled in for January, February next year. So next summer might be an opportune moment to look at a potential informal gathering of the two councils. Obviously, in your usual committee meetings, you would receive the outcomes of that external assessment, as you did last time, and then you could have an informal discussion between the two councils on your views of that as well. But
Yeah, I can take that back as an action and can make arrangements for that for you.
Yeah. On that, I mean, audit's just one of the services that we jointly have. We've just recently resurrected the joint board between us and Gravesham, looking at CCTV, and we've met a couple of times to agree our new sort of partnership agreement. I did take the opportunity at that time to informally ask my opposite number, Gravesham, how they were happy with the service, not just with CD, but generally. And I was pleased to get a very positive feedback. But perhaps if we could sort of widen it out as a sort of, to cover, the other bits, legal as well, if it's going to be an informal meeting, because, it would be good, from both sides to know how each other feels it's working. So I think that, last time I think we just stuck to audit, did we not, James? But I just wonder if people want to stick to audit, albeit, but I think if we're going to meet and it's informal, we perhaps could widen it to cover all the other services, licensing and everything. We could all get round the table and have a general discussion and from both sides and see how it's going. Probably a useful thing to do. Good suggestion, Tristan.
I think it depends largely on where those particular services report within each council. Obviously, legal services don't strictly report here apart from certain aspects, and it's the same thing for Gravesham. So I think logistically, you potentially end up with both full councils trying to squeeze into a room. So it might be a little bit problematic to go beyond a specific service.
You're right.
Yep.
I think we'll pass on that one, Adrian, for the moment. Okay. Lauren.
Just one final one, if I could. So I think just, personally, it seems that waiting 6 months before asking for a reason for why an action is overdue is a little bit too generous. That's just my personal view. I'm slightly concerned to see something like an adult social care finding or set of findings, which I think is on page 144, where you've got 3 high priority actions that are due and none have been completed, and there's not really a requirement for the management team to explain why that is. I would personally like to see that 6 months brought forward a bit. So just a comment really, and a question about whether that 6 month limit is kind of in line with other local authority functions or some kind of internal audit guidance. And then just another point, I was really pleased to see that I think back in the June meeting there was a lot more actions that were outstanding longer than 6 months. So just really welcome the fact that's come down to just the one, which is really great progress. But just in terms of the information that's presented to us, it is a high priority action, and there's really nothing in the paper that tells us why there's been such a big delay, and also when it's expected to be completed. I mean, it does sort of sound like it's, progress has been made and it's in its final stages, but it would be helpful to have that commitment for a completion date. because it does seem like it's 9 to 10 months overdue, and I'm just wondering, what kind of conversation sort of happens between management and internal audit in that scenario? What's the escalation? Is it you sort of sitting down with the relevant person and having a sort of a full and frank discussion? Just kind of wondering what happens in that scenario. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. It's down to each individual council to set up a process for how they're going to follow up on their actions or recommendations. The way our process works is at the final, when the review is finalised, the dates for implementation are actually set by the service. We're not supposed to influence how they address the control issues because obviously it potentially harms our future independence. So it is very much down to the service to determine how they're going to deal with them. Obviously, high priority actions, you would want those addressed as quickly as possible, but in some instances, such as that particular one that is outstanding more than 6 months, it's not a short process to get the policy done and through the various consultations and committee processes. I think perhaps their target date was a bit too ambitious at the start, but as you can see, they are now close to getting it sorted out. The process itself, when it reaches the implementation date, we contact the responsible officer. If it's still outstanding, it's the same thing. We have a monthly follow-up. So at the end of the next month, we'll go to them again. Corporate management team receive a quarterly report that tells them a bit more granular detail, the individual actions. These are the ones that are now due. These have been implemented. These haven't, and it's on a quarterly basis. And we report the current quarter, what's still outstanding from the previous quarter, and there's also a warning, if you like. These are the ones that are becoming due in the coming quarter. The reason members receive specific detail on the ones that are more than 6 months overdue was basically because that was at the committee's request. So as you can see in the table in section 8, we do give you an overview of all of the recommendations where they're at based on our follow-up process, but the specific detail is about those ones that have gone well beyond where they were expected to be completed.
I think you'll find, Lauren, that this is an ongoing issue that has been for quite a while. It's been with us for many times, but the good side of it is, when I first joined, there was a lot more there than there is now. So it's quite obvious that we're going in the right direction, but it is down to, as James said, the management side of the department that really needs to come back to them on a stronger basis. Okay, I'm now going to make the recommendations on page 116, which is the committee is asked to note the outputs and performance against the internal audit plan for Medway for the period of the 1st of April, 31st of August 2022, as detailed in Appendix 1. And 8.2, the committee is asked to approve the revisions to the agreed internal audit plan for quarters 1 and quarter 2. Are we all agreed? We agree. Thank you, members. Now go on to item 11, which is the counter fraud update report from the 1st of April to the 31st of August 2022. And it will be James again. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the report at Appendix 1 is the first update on progress against the plan for this year. This being the first year that we've had a dedicated counter-fraud plan, which is why we are reporting on it separately. Just again to take you through a few key things. So Section 3, commencing on page 152 of your pack, shows how resources have been used over the period, detailing the level of time spent on each of the key areas outlined in the plan. The tables in Section 4, commencing on page 154, provide an overview of the work undertaken in each of those areas on the plan. So for fraud awareness and prevention, we've committed to resource to fraud awareness activity to try and seek improvements in this area following the results of the counter-fraud survey. The fraud risk assessments are also in progress with initial assessments, put my teeth back in, for inherent scores having been completed. For proactive counter-fraud activity, there has been a heavy concentration of resource directed to the National Fraud Initiative to clear matches that other services have been unable to deal with and also reduce the number within our own remit. The savings relating to each exercise are detailed for information, but it should be noted that these cross financial years, so they won't tally exactly with the other statistics and savings detailed in the report. The table commencing on page 155 shows the summary of results from external investigations and the associated savings in the period. And there's a brief summary of other counter-fraud activity in the table on page 156. What I've neglected to include is the value of HB overpayments and excess council tax reduction awards that arise from investigations undertaken by the Department for Work and Pensions. This will be in future reports, but for members' information during the reporting period, reassessments of claims as a consequence of requests from DWP investigations have resulted in housing benefit overpayments of 33,558 and excess council tax reduction of 3,481. I'll make sure that information is included in future. An update against the team's key performance indicators for this reporting period is provided at section 5 of the report, which is on page 157. Our 2 investigators continue with their apprenticeship to become accredited counter-fraud specialists. And unexpectedly, our new intelligence officer was able to go on a course and recently passed exams to become an accredited counter-fraud technician. We didn't anticipate that at the start of the year, so as a result, we've already exceeded the target for a number of staff with professional qualifications. Approximately 274 investigations have been concluded with associated cashable savings of just over 242,000 and notional savings of 4,000 during the period. This is in comparison to Medway's share of the counter-fraud costs of the shared service, which are approximately 141, well, just shy of 142,000 for the whole year. So I think you'll agree that's pretty good value for money. I'm happy to take any questions members may have.
I'll open up to the floor. No, we all agreed on that? Okay, lovely. I'll go straight to the recommendation then, which is 8.1. The committee is asked to note the outputs and performance of the counter-fraud team for Medway for the period 1st of April to the 31st of August 2022, as detailed in Appendix 1. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you, members. Now take item 12 on the agenda, which is the internal audit work plan for quarter 3 and quarter 4 for 22-23. Your floor again, James.
Thank you, Chair. As explained in March, we took a different approach to planning this year, and you previously agreed a plan for quarter 1, quarter 2. The intention being that the risk assessment used to inform the audit plan would be updated to ensure that we continue to direct our resource to the highest risk areas throughout the year. It was also thought that this would allow us to manage the available resource more efficiently. There was an unexpected impact on the original plan when one of the internal auditors resigned shortly after it was agreed, effectively torpedoing what I was thinking for the year. And those impacts on resource have been detailed in the update report that you've already seen this evening. Our risk assessment was refreshed in July, along with updates to the level of resource expected to be available for the remainder of the year, and a draft plan for quarter 3, quarter 4 can be found at Appendix 1. Which can be found there, has been prepared. Overall, the number of reviews predicted to be undertaken during the year has reduced slightly due to those impacts on projected resources, but the plan itself continues to be focused on the highest areas of risk to provide necessary assurance to the Council. As with the plan for quarter 1, quarter 2, each review has been assigned an indicative figure of 15 days for planning purposes, but the internal audit manager will have freedom to reduce or increase the allocated budget for individual reviews to ensure that it provides the correct level of assurance. I'm now seeking the committee's approval for the proposed plan for the remainder of the year. I'm happy to take any questions.
I'll open it up to the floor again. Hey, Jim.
Just one like to comment on. I've actually read it again, and I think because which is number 32, frontline services, car parking, smart parking. You're just doing the arrangement because the thought occurred to me actually the smart parking, apart from the ANPR system that's been for some time in the 2 multi-storey car parks, we've not really got a smart parking system unless you include Ringo in that. But the ANPR systems are going to be fitted in a number of the Rochester car parks. And I think it would be very interesting, probably at a later date, James, to do some work on the comparison of income levels, because there was quite a lot of argument over whether we should put ANPR in at all, because that would actually then stop the PCN income. With ANPR, there'd be no PCN income at all, but that would be offset by the fact that we haven't got to have staff patrolling those car parks, and also enables those staff to be redeployed to the real safety stuff, which is on-street parking, where you've got people parking on W lines, which is an actual safety issue. So, you know, there's quite a lot of stuff, I think, to be learned from that exercise once he's up. But I presume this is just the management of installing the equipment, is it, and the ordering it and that sort of thing at this stage?
Yeah, that's correct. At this stage, what we're looking at is reviewing the arrangements to actually implement that scheme and obviously manage it where it has already been put in place. So what we'll be looking at is there any risks around that area and making sure that the controls are there and are working effectively in terms of the project management and managing those that have already been put in.
Just as an aside, I mean, I did make a fundamental error with Ringo a couple of weeks ago, part because I had an early meeting in Chatham, part using Ringo quickly, and I realised I'd put one of my grandson's cars that was on my Ringo account, and the car, I paid for 2 hours parking for a car that was in Cornwall, and I got a PCN notice, but fortunately I had proof that I'd paid it, and they did do it. But that's a lesson for us all. Whilst these systems are actually brilliant when they work, but if you get it wrong and pay for a car that's in Cornwall, that's not quite so good. But it was good to see the guy was doing his job, so I've got no complaint about that at all.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question about the risk assessment, the update that happened in July. Obviously, I appreciate that probably factored in your resource constraints, and I think we have obviously in the earlier papers discussed the things that have been dropped. Just wondering if you could talk a bit what's kind of changed in this second half of the year plan driven by that July risk assessment.
I'd have to go back to my paperwork to confirm exactly what's going on. Basically, at the start of the year, obviously, I had a plan in the background based on that initial risk assessment. This is probably what we could look at over the course of the year. That risk assessment, though, obviously, what I had to do was look at what's changed. I think things have changed a lot since I actually did that refresh of it, because obviously we've had a lot more going on. As has been mentioned, the macroeconomic changes and things like that are going to create further impacts. I'd have to go back to my notes. I think one of the things we were planning on looking at was, originally we had on there was something to do with schools, procurement. We were also going to look at certain areas of commissioning. I think we originally had children's commissioning on there. I think we also planned to look at adults commissioning in the second half of the year. But that's obviously come off for the same reason that children's has been removed. There was an independent external review of commissioning as a whole. Those are two of the changes. We've obviously made those changes to the original plan for quarter one, quarter two as well, to take account of our loss of resource. I'm trying to think off the top of my head what else might have come off. There wasn't a significant number of changes. As I said, there's just a few. I think with the 3 that we took off from quarter one, quarter two, and a couple here, I think there's about 5 or 6 less than I originally predicted us being able to do at the start of the year. So I can remember 2 of them off the top of my head, but I can't remember what the third one was.
Thank you, that's helpful. So it sounds like you're not really adding anything in because you're concerned about a change in the risk environment. It's more about what you're taking out for sound reasons or because of resourcing changes.
The resourcing changes have obviously made it necessary to make a number of changes to what we already had in place. When I refreshed the risk assessment, it didn't change the original. There wasn't anything at that point in time to change what I'd already kind of projected in the assessment that was done in January. Had there been, obviously that would have changed. We might have made a few some shuffles here and there. I'm trying to think. As I say, when you're doing it at the same time for 2 councils, things get a bit confusing. But yeah, obviously what we wanted to do was we wanted to be certain that the risk assessment that's undertaken in January, we were still reacting to the right things at a later point. There are some, we had an audit conference last week, and someone there from the Southwest Audit Partnership was talking about the fact that they don't have a set plan at all. They kind of, things are evolving literally every week, month, day. It's a bit more difficult for us to do that. I think, you know, again, because the committee approved these plans and things like that, it's an ever-changing one would be very difficult for you to monitor. But we did want, we are, essentially now people that have annual plans are in the minority, becoming the minority. A lot of people are switching to 6 monthly or 3 monthly plans so that they can be more responsive and adaptive to risk, because things are changing constantly across the piece at the moment.
One quick supplementary, if I could. I mean, is that something that you're considering, or are you still comfortable that annual plan, or is that something that we have asked for as a committee? Just wondering if we are thinking of changing, if that's the trend.
Well, as I say, I've took the decision to move to 6 monthly planning in preparation for this year, and as it now transpires, it was a wise move because that's what is being suggested is now best practice, at least 6 monthly. Some have gone a step further, as I say, and are doing quarterly plans. Others, I think, certainly a colleague who used to be at the Mid-Kent Partnership, he basically said, these are all the high priority areas, these are the medium priority. Our commitment is we will look at all of the high priority ones and a percentage of the medium ones over the course of the year. Where I question myself whether that fits completely with what the standards expect from us, because the committee aren't necessarily approving the plan that's going to happen, because it's very much, oh, well, we're going to do a portion of those, but not which ones. So for me, I think that maybe is going a step too far, but I think moving to 6 monthly to at least ensure that we're looking at that risk assessment again and making sure that we are still focusing on the right things, I think that was definitely a wise move.
Katie, yeah?
If I may just make a comment. So my career started in internal audit, so I used to be in James's role, but I've obviously jumped aside, and now you'll notice that my services make up much of his client group, right? So he's constantly reporting on my services, and whilst I like the idea that we've got a responsive plan, I also like knowing that I'm going to get some assurance over some of my key functions kind of in a planned, programmed way that means that I can make sure we've got the resources to spend the time with your officers to actually get that work done and to maximise the value of that to our team. So I think for me, where we are is probably about where I get an appropriate level of assurance and a reasonable amount of time to plan, you know, and just sort of make sure that we can free up the capacity to support that work as well. So it's working for me as a client, I think.
Okay, thank you, members. I'll now go to the recommendation at 7.1 of the report on page 160, which is the committee is asked to approve the internal audit plan for quarter 3, quarter 4 for 22-23 as presented in Appendix 1. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you, members. Can I just say thanks to Ibby and Darren from Grant Thornton for their time tonight? And I now declare the meeting closed.